Welcome, everyone, to the Preschool Neuroscience Summit. Today, I'm really excited to introduce you to Erin Clabough. She is a author, teacher, and doing lots of work around neuroscience. She has a PhD in neuroscience. She's a mom of four, and she's really brought all this knowledge into her own parenting. So she is the author of a book that's really fascinating called Second Nature: How Parents Can Use Neuroscience to Help Kids Develop Empathy, Creativity, and Self-Control. So really excited to have you here. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be able to speak with you today.
Thanks. So Erin's session today is called How to Teach Self-Regulation Through Empathy, Creativity, and Self-Control. So really excited to learn more about this. So let's start off with this concept of creativity. Can creativity be taught?
So yes, when I was looking in the literature to see for my own kids if this is something that can be taught or if it is kind of an innate thing, the literature suggests that creativity can definitely be taught, but we don't necessarily know how to do it. And I think that one of the things that was interesting is it seems like kids naturally have all these ideas bubbling up all the time. And I'm sure, in preschool, we see this where everybody kind of has a different way of doing things, or they draw from other experiences in a way that you wouldn't have thought of doing. And part of the process of what our society terms kind of growing up is squishing those impulses that are not going to be rewarding for us. Part of this is if someone's going to be critical of an idea that we have, or if somebody, makes fun of it, or if it doesn't work when we try it, we'll be a lot more likely in the future to kind of crush that down. So I do feel like there is an element that society thinks, and it's probably true, that we do have a lot more creative ability and capacity when we're younger, and that part of our formal schooling system kind of crushes this creativity because we're taught to be more convergent thinkers rather than divergent thinkers. And it's interesting because creativity itself is composed of two really different schools of thought. So there's the convergent creativity, which is knowing everything that you know in the world and using it to come to one correct answer. So if I gave you some lists, there's a remote associations test that will tell you, like, the words would be shooting and Hollywood, and I'm making these up, dust or something, and you would have to come up with the word star that links all of those things together. So that's an example of like convergent thinking. The other one is what we think of more as like out of the box thinking, and that's divergent, where you're starting at one point and everyone's at the same place, and then you're trying to get someplace else by coming up with really different ways to get there. So an example of this would be something like if I showed you a paper clip and I asked you to, in 1 minute, name all the different things that you could use that paper clip for. So obviously holding papers together, but also resetting, an electronic device that's not working, or now I'm taking this test as we speak and I'm doing poorly. But all the things that you could use a paperclip for. So maybe a hair clip if your barrette isn't working or something. There's so many different things that everybody can come up with. So I think it's really important that people recognize that there are two forms of these creative thought processes, and that when you're going through the creative sequence where you need to, have an idea, and then you need to kind of think about a problem, and then you need to have an aha moment, and then you need to carry that to fruition, that both these things are at play. And in our schooling, we end up concentrating on the convergent, getting to one correct answer. And I think it's really important that we allow for a lot more of this divergent thinking, because any skill, if you practice it, will become more second nature. So this is going to be something that is less effortful for us to do. It'll be more of like a thinking habit or a learning habit. And so we will approach things in a bigger, kind of more divergent way, even if they're not directly related to creativity, but we'll pull it in as a learning tool for our own process.
Yeah, so interesting, and interesting that schools just tend to focus on the one way of thinking and not promote both of those ways when we know they're both so beneficial, right? So,
Well, it's also
um,
easy to see why, right? Because in
yeah,
a classroom, it's really hard to manage a bunch of children who are all engaged in their own divergent thinking,
yeah,
right? So it can spiral kind of quickly in a classroom setting
yeah,
without structure on it. It's also really hard to assess. So how do you measure somebody else's creative process?
yeah,
Right. And so it makes sense why it's harder to do. It's harder to teach and it's harder to let kids experience. But I think equally important to realize that there have been studies that show that when you use creativity, that it's rewarding. So it taps into dopamine pathways and it's inherently something that we enjoy doing.
yeah,
Um, and if you do this and the dopamine is released during the learning process, then this actually is important for the learning process itself. So if you learn something in a creative way, and you tap into those same synapses that are connection with regular learning, it's going to solidify that learning better. So if you get there on your own, you're going to have more ownership of it, but you also probably will retain that information better.
yeah. Wow, so important. So, Erin, is there like a critical window for children to learn these skills?
No. So there are these ideas of these critical periods or windows. We've seen 0 to 3, we've seen 0 to 5. It almost depends on what literature you're looking at or what country you live in to see what your government has put out in terms of national guidelines. And although it is true that there are certain systems that need like a basic amount of input in order to form correctly, two of the most, I guess, well-known examples would be the visual system. So if you don't get visual input within the certain couple of first years of life, then you can have long-lasting defects in the way that your visual system is set up. But we're talking about like not basic input. You don't need the flashing lights and the little like baby toys where there's techno music playing in order to better make these pathways form. Instead, just normal kind of experience will do it. But if you have something like astigmatism, or if you have something where you have an eye that doesn't focus correctly with the other eye in the same field, you can have lifelong deficits. So that needs to be corrected in the first couple of years. Things like language is another one where if you don't hear any language in the first couple of years, it'll be harder for you to learn later. And the reason for this is because when our neurons are actually through the stage of development, there's a process of about 5 developmental steps. And one of these is that the neurons can respond to experience and make proper connections. And their axons, which is what they talk to other neurons with, they actually have to find their ways to the neurons they're supposed to connect to and make functional connections, or they won't survive in the nervous system. And when you have something like this process happening, it's experience dependent. And so these neurons, they're trying to find their way with their axons. They're going to be responding to certain cues, the little molecules that are there in the places that they're supposed to be heading toward. And when we're setting up our cortical maps, there are definitely time periods where our body expresses these, and after development we cannot express them as much, and so those cues might not be there in order for the axons to find their kind of targets that might be kind of far away from them. So there are certain critical periods for some things. However, having said that, with neurodevelopment, we've got these basic stages. When babies are in the womb, they've got neurons are being born and they're migrating to where they're supposed to go in the adult brain. Then we have a period of synaptogenesis, so forming connections between two neurons. These neurons themselves either make functional connections or they die. So this is the whole use it or lose it. And that starts to happen in the middle of pregnancy, and it never really stops. So there's not a time when synaptogenesis is over. And I think
Right.
we've seen that there's these bursts of when synapses are really kind of forming, which is true in the first couple years of life, and that it decreases, but we retain the capability to always form new synapses, which is how we learn. And then the last stage of development is going to be a myelination event. So myelin is something that makes neuronal connections faster, and it's the last thing to mature in our brains. And it starts in the end of pregnancy, and it goes all the way through like the 3rd decade of life. So this is where neurodevelopment actually is still happening in college students. And interestingly, it's happening in the prefrontal cortex area, where we see maybe some problems with what we see as non-mature behavior, because
Right.
it's really not done myelinating yet and becoming faster. So with this knowledge, then you can see that even though the earlier you get on board with some of the things, the better. There's not like a cutoff. So if you have a child come in to preschool and has low self control, or has low levels of empathy, or has not really shown a creative interest in things in the classroom, this doesn't mean that kind of their window is over and you got to work with what you have. In fact, studies have shown that training on all 3 of these things seems to make the most benefit for people who come in at lower levels to begin with. So targeting kind of the kids that need it the most seems to allow them to make the greatest bounds.
Right. Yeah. So important to for us to do that. So, Erin, what are some of the best ways to work on self-control with children?
So self-control is like as preschool classrooms, this is going to be the thing that we probably say more than anything else. So make good choices, right? Self-control is one of the things we have to work on. And it's interesting that we typically have to work on it kind of more with a certain subset of our population. And it becomes, if we're not careful, more about classroom management, where we're trying to figure out how to let the rest of the class have a good experience without letting this certain subset kind of ruin it for everybody. So in terms of self-control, my research showed when I was looking into these skills is that the other 2 things in the Second Nature book, so creativity and empathy, are actually going to be extraordinarily important pillars for self-control to pull from in order to have what we would consider to be good self-regulation. So self-control, as I define it, is more like saying no to yourself or not permitting yourself to do certain things. Self-regulation, on the other hand, is going to be the ability to say yes. And so what it means is the difference between not doing something that you feel like you want to do and will like not permit you to reach your goal, versus self-regulation is where you can say, okay, I am seeing a no. So I still see my goal. How can I get to my goal? So this is creative process in a way that doesn't hurt other people around me. That's the empathy. So if we teach children more, it's okay to have a goal and to work toward it. You don't have to hear an actual no and have that be the end of it, but maybe let's talk about other ways we can get there. And when we're considering all these creative options, which ones can we discard because they're going to influence somebody else negatively? So you can still reach your goal and kind of, it's more like channeling a river rather than damming it up. So self-regulation is what, the holy grail there of preschool is. We want to work on these skills with kids, and we want to start it as young as we can so that we give them the tools to really start to have ownership of their own lives and to be able to not let issues like self-control, where they're not able to restrain themselves from doing things, not let that get in the way of them reaching their own goals as kids and as adults, really.
Yeah. So you wrote this book for parents. So how can as parents and teachers learning about neurodevelopment help us to help the children that we're raising or teaching in class to learn these skills in a more productive way?
Well, I think it's really important that all parents and educators have a basic understanding of just regular neural development. In our society, I feel like we tend to only bring in brain facts, and as parents especially focus on this when there's a problem. So when you have a diagnosis of, let's say, ADHD or of autism, all of a sudden you go and look up everything that you can learn about it because you want to do the best for your child, given certain restraints in their perhaps atypical neurodevelopment. So I think that this is doing really all of society a real disservice, that the only people who really delve into this literature seems to be the people who are working with a problem. And actually, neurodevelopment as a continuum, knowing that your baby doesn't kind of get born completely formed, right? It's not a mini adult. And also, it's not a blank slate when it comes out either. That it's a continuum that starts, that there's not certain things that are only coming online right when the baby emerges from the womb, but instead this is something where these pathways have been laid down, and all of a sudden at birth there's all this, I guess, opportunity for experiences or the nurture to play more of a role of what nature has set up. And in particular, knowing about kind of what we can do to make a difference versus what is genetically programmed or what really we have no control over as parents and educators, I think is really helpful, because it allows us to be liberated from some of the guilt that comes sometimes from feeling like you're not doing enough. But it also allows us to really target our efforts on the things that are really important. And so I think this is one of the big things that myself as a neuroscience mother ended up struggling with, is where do I focus my efforts? Do I do it on math facts? Do I do it on making sure that their visual system is, coming on board the way it should? So my poor children probably had more like kind of, how is this working, than most kids. But that's why I came to these three kind of pillars: the creativity, the self-control, and the empathy, because I felt like if I wasn't teaching these things, that they may or may not get it in the school setting. My experience has been that they were not getting it. So instead of getting tools to work through conflict, instead they were getting a day that was structured around avoiding conflict. So they were getting put in separate tables, or they were getting 10-minute recesses, which really wasn't enough time to have the kind of mature play and arguments that you'll get with half-hour recesses. And it makes sense too, right? Because we talked about this regulation of the classroom, the management that has to go in when there are problems that might last the entire year sometimes.
Yeah. So incredible also to me that like we're not taught this in teacher training school, or it's kind of a very small part of teachers training. And then for parents, as you said, it's just kind of comes up when there's an issue, and it's so important. I think all of those areas that you talked about. So can you tell us a little bit about
that really fast?
Yeah,
so
sure.
I do find it interesting that in recent years there has been some neuroscience content that's been put into curricula, but it's been like in business schools, or it's been like in master's level things. So they found that when they're trying to teach people about the creative process, if they also teach those people how the brain works in terms of connections and neurons and synapses, that they end up being better at learning how to be creative. So this kind of like meta of how thinking about how we think is very powerful, not just as adults, but I think it's really powerful as well for kids to understand this is how a neuron works. This is how synapses get stronger. They get stronger when you use them. So repeated use between this neuron and this neuron, if you make this pathway go, over time, the ease of flow between these two neurons will improve. It'll get easier and it'll take less effort for you. I think that's a goal that kids can get on board with. Oh, if I do this the first 3 times, it's going to be really hard. The 4th time I decide to sit in my seat, maybe it'll be a little easier. The 10th time I make a decision to sit in my seat or to not blurt out the answer or whatever it is in terms of like a self-control issue, it'll be even easier. I think that that's hope. That kids who have been labeled as like self-control issues, who have a little individual desk that sits right in front of the teacher's desk under her eye, like that's important to give those kids the basic neuroscience facts so that they understand no matter what a teacher says about them, no matter what a parent or another classmate No matter what, somebody makes a rude comment about them being on a drug to treat ADHD, that they understand that certain elements of this, they are in control of.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so important. And kids they can understand these things when we present them in simple terms like you just did. And I think, yeah, the hope I think is a great way to describe that, and something to work towards, right? So Erin, tell us a little bit about empathy, the different forms of empathy, and how we can help teach children about that.
Sure. So when I was looking in the empathy literature, I figured out that there are actually 3 distinct forms of empathy, which was surprising to me because I think of empathy as you look like you're going through something that's hard and I feel bad for you. Right. And so apparently there is a myriad of different versions of this. And it's interesting, the 2 main ways that you can break up empathy are things that we feel and things that we think. So things that we feel about empathy would be emotional empathy. Things that we think about empathy would be cognitive empathy. And so it turns out that they have completely different brain networks and pathways that kind of mediate both of those. And so you can tap into just the emotional component, and you can tap into just the thinking component, or you can tap into both of them together. So I think it's important to understand that they're separate. I think it's important to understand that you can have one without the other. And I think that it's important for us to understand the differences so that we can kind of tailor individual empathy training to what a child may or may not already have. So if you have a child who is extremely emotionally empathetic, they may feel really upset when somebody else is crying. They may actually be so upset by that, but that might impact their own functioning. So they may be incapacitated by their kind of feeling for this other person. And somebody might look at that child and say, well, they don't need empathy training at all. They need to be less empathetic. But in reality, what they need is an avenue to release that for them. And so the cognitive form of empathy is going to be a little bit different than that. This would be totally a thought process. So this is using body cues, using what you know about how that situation might play out in the future, so predicting behavior. This is looking at the eyes, perhaps. This is what you know about their past actions and experiences that you've had in order to understand perspective taking. So if you were that person, how would you feel? You don't actually have to experience it, but it's a thought process completely to understand standing in their shoes. This is one of these kind of old mottos that are, how would you feel if you were in this person's shoes? So this is completely like a verbal thought process if you want to try to translate into verbiage. And this is really, it's emotion naming in a different way than the emotional child is having. So the emotional child might need to be taught, name this emotion, process this emotion. And the person who is doing cognitive empathy might be naming the emotion that that other person is having. These 2 things are both kind of avenues towards the 3rd kind of empathy, which is compassion or applied empathy. This is when somebody acts to relieve the suffering of others. You can go from emotional empathy to thinking empathy to a compassionate act through all those things. But you don't have to go in that order. You could go emotion straight to a compassionate act. This is where somebody who's feeling bad might actually make a move to hug somebody because it actually relieves their own suffering. Or you could do no emotions at all and simply put yourself in the perspective of somebody else and send them a care package or something where you don't have to actually feel something to know that these are the steps you could take to make somebody feel better. So those 3 things together, understanding that they're different moving parts of the same idea, I think is really important for teachers. Emotional empathy can't be taught as easily because our emotions are typically not under our control if they spring up or not. It's under our control what to do with them, and we can work at that, but nobody can force anybody to have an emotion. The second one, the cognitive empathy, this is one that we can work on and that we can get better at and we can have training at. And lots of studies have showed that cognitive empathy training works to increase empathy levels. And it works in preschoolers, it works in high schoolers, it works in medical students to boost empathy. And so this would be the equivalent of just paying attention to these situations where empathy is needed. So like doing tests where you look at somebody's, just their eyes right here.
Yeah.
And you can, from this, try to make a guess at what the best emotion is that fits what they actually are experiencing.
Right.
Recognizing the signs of when somebody's sad. Trying to predict what someone will do. This is particularly important in bullying situations. If you're able to teach the person who's being bullied to have empathy for the bully, it gives them a sense of control. It allows them to try to anticipate what the bully might do. It allows them to try to understand the reasons why the bully might be doing that kind of behavior. And those things are really empowering to children. So the idea that empathy can be used as a tool for not just somebody who's being mean, and so you say, oh, they need some empathy training, but really for everyone, because it makes us better at social interactions. And it'll end up, there's a lot of studies that show that people who are more empathetic end up in healthier relationships. They might stay married long. They might actually be healthier in terms of their overall health and immune system response. So there's a lot of literature out there that shows that it's good for everybody, not just for people that we kind of peg as needing to have empathy, more empathy.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, and so many lifelong benefits there. So I know it's fascinating. I know in Denmark they're teaching empathy starting at 4 and going right through to high school, and I find it really, really fascinating what they're doing there. I think it can make a huge difference. So, Erin, can you tell us just before we finish, or maybe share a practical example of how we might bring mindfulness into this neuroscience discussion that we've been having? What is something that a parent or a teacher might do?
Sure. So one of the easiest ways to get mindfulness on board is to use mindfulness after there's some kind of a conflict situation. So the book has a couple of avenues for conflict tools that are named after acronyms. One is directed at people who kind of are the perpetrator or the person who got in trouble. And the other is kind of directed at people who are feeling like they're being in a situation where they're not being heard or they want a different outcome. So this might be the person on the receiving end of the conflict. So the one that is designed for the perpetrators, this would be basically what you would use when you would send a kid to timeout, so the equivalent of a timeout. We use this a lot where we say, you know what, you need a thinking spot, you need to have a mindful moment, right? Just separate yourself out from the situation, you're upset, and when you come back, we'll kind of talk it out. So the acronym is OUT, so it's OUT, and it allows a little bit of a framework for the child when they come out of taking this mindful moment before they can reintegrate into the classroom or into the play situation where the conflict was. And so it's helpful because if you do it consistently, it allows the child to have something to actually think about in the timeout rather than just waiting until you say that she or he can come back into the game. And it also, it promotes certain skills that hopefully will make this behavior not happen again in the future. So the O stands for ownership. So you really don't want a situation where someone caused a problem, goes into timeout, comes out, and basically was like, sorry, but not really owns what they did. So it's important in terms of not letting certain people who tend to be involved in conflict situations skate around their role in it and kind of say, well, you did this, and so I just reacted kind of thing. So taking ownership, so if it was on the playground and somebody went on the slide too fast and slammed into somebody at the bottom, but the person on the bottom maybe thought that they did it on purpose, and so there was some kind of a scuffle at the bottom. The person who had ended up, in the timeout would come out and say, this was my role. And they don't have to make commentary on what the other person did. They just own exactly what they did, because as preschool teachers probably say everywhere, the only person we're in charge of is ourselves, right? So the ownership of what is theirs. And then it's the you. So you stands for understand how the other person would feel. So this is an exercise in cognitive empathy. So you would have the person who's coming out of timeout, I ran into you at the bottom of the slide and knocked you over. That probably made you feel hurt, feel upset, feel scared, these kinds of things. So try to get them to name what the other person might be feeling. And then the out, we want to basically have them tell the way that they're going to do it differently next time. So they may not be able to be in charge of if they hit somebody when they come down the slide, but they could say, if I ever accidentally knock somebody over again, I will immediately ask them if they're okay, and that might dissolve their situation. But the forward thinking part of the tell how you'll do it differently sometime, this is gonna, so that in the OUT, that O standing for ownership is gonna really help with the self-regulation, because you're owning what you did and allowing you to prepare for the next two steps. So the U, the understanding how it made someone feel, is gonna tap into empathy. And then the T, the tell how you'll do it differently, this is gonna require creativity on the child's part. The empathy also really requires empathy, creativity to be able to understand what someone's feeling. But they need to come up with a solution that will work. And if they think through the way that they do it differently the next time, the hope is that you're kind of bridging a map out of the woods of that situation. So if you think about it, if you are in your house and you have a fire and you have a fire drill plan, you've never used that fire drill plan probably, but you know what to do. So the same thing goes with the out, with the T. So you know that when you're in that situation again, you already thought through it and you chose to immediately say, I'm so sorry it was an accident, and diffuse the situation. And so saying those things as they come out of timeout basically walks them through the process. It also doesn't require anything of the person who's been wronged. So the person doesn't need to forgive them. The person doesn't need to say, I'm sorry back. They just need to listen. And I think this is really important in situations when you don't have two willing participants. So then the person who made the mistake, who caused the conflict, has now been released from the conflict, whether or not the other person gave them permission. They're giving themselves permission. They've walked through these three things and they can go on with their day. So that kind of mindful moment with structure, I think, is really important in conflict situations. And it also can be important so that the mindful moment is used well. And it's not just somebody sitting there kicking their feet, waiting for the timer to hit 5 minutes because they're 5 years old and now they can reintegrate into the classroom. It also takes time. So if you are sending somebody to have a mindful moment or a timeout, you also need to allow a couple minutes upon reentry to talk it out right then, to not do it later. But when they come back into the classroom or the social situation, it needs to be dealt with right away.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all those practical strategies with us and the research behind why those particular ideas are so important for us to bring in to children, as mentioned, as young as possible, so that they have those tools to bring with them through life. So thank you again. We'll have Erin's book in her speaker bio, if you'd like to order that, and links to her social media so you can follow her other work. And I just want to say thank you again for joining us and sharing on the summit today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.